Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 457. I'm the host, Kyle Lanslone. I got quite a bit to talk about on today's show. Some news about the war in Ukraine, some news about American military spending, and I want to spend some time covering the coup in Niger. So, important stuff to talk about on today's show. Be sure to share the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where right now we are hosting a fundraiser and we have matching funds. So, head on over to the Institute and your donation will be doubled. For those of you who have already donated, we really appreciate it. And again, if you haven't donated yet, you got a few dollars lying around. We are a 501c3, so that will allow you to write it off on your taxes. And help give us some support. And like I said, your donation will be doubled. With that, let's get into the news today. The first article wrote for the Libertarian Institute on August 9th. The Pentagon plans to put hypersonic missiles on problematic warships. I write, the Pentagon is planning to put an expensive upgrade onto its problem-plagued Zumwalt-class destroyers. The Department of Defense is preparing to equip the USS Zumwalt with hypersonic missile launchers. The retrofitting is full of potential pitfalls, including that the Pentagon has yet to develop hypersonic missiles for the destroyer, and the Zumwalt has struggled to make it into port to receive the upgrade. In a press release last week, the U.S. Navy said the USS Zumwalt departed San Diego on August 1st and will shift to its home port from San Diego to Mississippi to enter a modernization period and receive technology upgrades, including integration of the conventional prompt strike weapon system. And that conventional prompt strike is the name of the hypersonic weapon system for ships. The Army and the Navy are jointly working on it, and they're using the acronym CPS. The press release added, the upgrades will ensure the Zumwalt remains one of the most technologically advanced and lethal ships in the U.S. Navy. The Navy explained the Zumwalt's journey was delayed after the ship was forced to return to port in San Diego for repairs. The Pentagon did not reveal the cause of the issue, and the repairs lasted for 5 days. Initially, the Department of Defense planned to buy 32 Zumwalt-class ships. However, that number was reduced to 3 because the ships were riddled with problems and skyrocketing costs. The most significant issue with the destroyers is the ships lack a primary weapon. In 2016, the Pentagon estimated the 3 ships would cost over $22 billion. The Navy wanted a 155mm cannon for the ship's main weapon. However, each round for the gun was expected to cost $800,000. The Pentagon's solution to the problem is to equip the Zumwalt-class destroyers with hypersonic missiles, and the Navy hopes to deploy the CPS hypersonic missiles on the Zumwalt-class destroyers by 2025. The Zumwalt is the first of the 3 destroyers to be getting the upgrade, and some of the other problems with the destroyers include their propulsion systems and their hulls are prone to tumbling. And so, we have a ship here who it can't even really be moved into the Coast Guard for rescue missions or something like that, because my understanding is it still doesn't do particularly well in turbulent waters. While the Department of Defense hopes that another expensive upgrade will finally turn the Zumwalt-class destroyers into ships capable of fighting in war, Michael Clare explains that next-generation weaponry rarely produces the outcome the Pentagon predicts. He wrote earlier this year, and devoting all those billions of dollars to research on next-generation weaponry, the Pentagon's rationale is straightforward. Spend now to ensure the military superiority in the 2040s and 2050s and beyond. But however persuasive this concept may be, even with all those mammoth sums of money pouring in, things rarely work out so neatly, and major investment of this sort by one country is bound to trigger countermoves from its rivals, ensuring that any technological advantage will soon be overcome in some fashion. And so, again, they think that this is a, great upgrade for these ships, and it likely won't pan out how they are hoping. So, we're going to sink a lot of money into this to have it not play out. All right, the next article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on August 10th. American neo-Nazi training forces in Maine to fight for Ukraine. Christopher Palhaus Pohlhaus, a former Marine and prominent neo-Nazi, has purchased land in Maine to train soldiers to fight for Ukraine. He sees the war against Russia as a unique chance to fight alongside the Azov Battalion and defend a nearly, quote, all-white nation. Last year, Pohlhaus bought at least 10 acres of land in Springfield, Maine. This is a very small town. They estimate about 400 people live there, although he claims he owns over 100 acres. Pohlhaus has discussed his ambitious plans for Maine training grounds on social media. In a Telegram channel he posted, "There will likely not be another chance in my lifetime to fight alongside other National Socialist men against a multi-ethnic invading empire to defend an almost all-white nation," and there he's speaking about Ukraine. In a post on X, formerly Twitter, Pohlhaus confirmed he hoped his Blood Tribe, that's the name of the group he leads, would join the Azov Battalion and C-14, prominent Ukrainian neo-Nazi militias, in the fight against Russia. Scott Horton, the director of the Libertarian Institute, tweeted an article about the land in Maine and asked, "Are they going to fight with the Azov Battalion and C-14 on the Eastern Front?" Pohlhaus, who goes by the nickname The Hammer, responded directly to Horton saying, "Yes, actually," and I linked the tweet here. I used the tweet as the cover for the photo for this article, so everybody could see it pretty nicely and neatly there, that, you know, this guy is verbatim saying that this is what we want to do. It is unclear how far the Blood Tribe fighters have progressed in their training. One reporter visited the site and said no group members were present. Local officials report Pohlhaus has not begun applying for permits to build structures on his property. He said that he has purchased a sawmill and plans to build cabins for his soldiers. Since civil war broke out in Ukraine after a coup in 2014, neo-Nazis have flocked to the country to fight for Kiev. Ukrainian neo-Nazis have held important positions in government, and National Socialist militias have played a crucial part in Kiev's war machine. Early in the war, thousands of neo-Nazis arrived in Ukraine to fight for what was described as a shared vision for an ultra-nationalist ethno-state. While Washington has attempted to dismiss the role of neo-Nazis in Ukraine as Russian propaganda, the New York Times admitted that Western journalists were asking Ukrainian troops to remove neo-Nazi symbols before taking photos of them. So that shows just how prominent that this problem is, that, you know, they're actually having to ask soldiers to take off their Nazi patches. You know, there's so many of them, they can't take photos without the Nazi patches getting in them. Additionally, the Russian Volunteer Corps, a militia aligned with Kiev, used American weapons to carry out attacks inside of Russia. The fighters in that group openly wear Nazi symbols such as the Black Sun. Pohlhaus also proudly displays symbols of his National Socialist ideology. Earlier this year, he led a protest in Ohio with several members displaying swastikas. While most of his Blood Tribe members wore full masks, Pohlhaus exposed his face and marched with a swastika flag. So, you know, this is a guy who has some pretty extreme views, and he's going to go to Ukraine. Now, I guess a couple things, you know, as a libertarian, people always wonder, well, how many of these people are feds? And, you know, maybe this guy is in some way working as an informant or some kind of operative for the FBI or CIA, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't sincerely believe in some of these National Socialist messages, you know, white supremacist messages that he is putting out, and isn't convincing other people to do so. And so, you know, this wouldn't be, of course, the first time that the FBI, CIA were, you know, investigating people. They were informants, and then it turned out that, you know, they committed more crimes than the you know, Americans have thought they would. So I think that this you know, that this is something that this guy could be a Fed, and this is still a significant issue that we have to address. I guess the second thing I wanted to mention on this is some people kind of see this story and they say, well, good, you know, if they want to go to Ukraine and fight for Kiev, they, you know, can do so. And, as a libertarian, I certainly don't believe that I have a right to say that somebody else can't go fight and die for a cause that they believe in. However, I think we do have to look at the long-term implications of this. There have been people who, as neo-Nazis go to Ukraine, come back, commit crimes. And so we do have to worry about, these people going to Ukraine, coming back radicalized. Even if Pohlhaus ends up dying, some of his other fighters could gain some real battlefield experience, come back with some pretty significant mental issues, and then do something really radical and violent. And this has happened in the past. I believe his name is Craig Lang, is a former military member who I think killed 2 people in Florida, and is, last I heard, was still in Ukraine fighting. He's, kind of known as a hero. So let's move on here and start talking about the war in Ukraine. Just a couple of stories on that today. Russia says it shot down 2 more drones headed towards Moscow. The Russian Defense Ministry said Wednesday that it shot down 2 drones overnight that were headed towards Moscow, as there has been a significant uptick in Ukrainian attacks on the capital city. And this is a statement from the Russian Defense Ministry. An attempt by Kiev regime to carry out a terrorist attack by unmanned aerial vehicles over the territory of the Moscow region was thwarted during the night. 2 drones were shot down by air defense systems, the Russian Defense Ministry said. According to the New York Times, Russian officials said they intercepted a total of 12 drones targeting Moscow over the past few weeks, as the attempt to hit the city have become nearly a daily occurrence. Some drones have struck buildings in Moscow, causing minor damage. The uptick in attacks on Moscow comes as Ukrainian President Zelensky says the war is gradually returning to Russian territory, to its symbolic centers and military bases. And it does seem that this came along with Ukraine's struggles on the battlefield to make any progress in their counteroffensive. And so we've seen more of these kind of attacks on civilian targets in Russia, on Moscow, and things like that. Now, I want to spend a minute here talking about the Poland-Belarus situation. I have thought, that there's no way that NATO will allow Poland to pick a fight with Belarus, because this will probably lead to direct war between Russia and NATO. And so, and likewise, I would imagine that Putin would prevent the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko from doing a similar thing for similar reasons. However, the tensions are escalating significantly here. So Polish officials said Wednesday that Warsaw will send an additional 2,000 troops to reinforce its border with Belarus as tensions between the two neighbors continue to rise. A Polish deputy interior minister said the deployment was double what the border guard requested. One purpose of the deployment is to stem the tide of migrants crossing the border, which Warsaw blames on Minsk. If we had a real border guards on the other side and not smuggling services, the crossings would not exist at all. Poland has been beefing up its border since Wagner fighters traveled to Belarus following a short-lived mutiny against the Russian military establishment launched by its mercenary group leader, Prigozhin. Polish officials estimate that there are 4,000 Wagner members in Belarus. Last week, the Polish Prime Minister claimed the Russian mercenaries were sent to Belarus to destabilize NATO's eastern flank and warned they could be planning provocations. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has played into the Polish fears by claiming the Wagner fighters said they wanted to go into Poland. Wagner members have also recently conducted drills near the Polish border. The Polish-Belarusian border has become a potential flashpoint for a conflict between NATO and Russia, as Russian President Putin has warned that he would treat an attack on Belarus as an attack on Russia. Now, we also have Washington taking some steps here, and that is a rash new sanctions, and this is from Connor Freeman at the Libertarian Institute, August 9th. The United States Treasury Department expanded its sanctions on Belarus, taking aim at the country's premier airline, as well as 3 more companies and a government office. These additional penalties, announced by the Office of Foreign Control on Wednesday, marked the 3rd anniversary of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko's disputed re-election. The OFAC, that's the Office of Foreign Asset Control, said that the broadened sanctions were a response to Ms. callous crackdown on the country's pro-democracy movement and the government's complicity with Moscow's war in Ukraine. Russian fighters launched attacks from positions in Belarus during the invasion of Ukraine last year. Although Belarus maintains a plethora of political prisoners, there are considerable foreign influences in the country's internal affairs, including by Washington and its partners. For instance, the exiled former Belarusian presidential candidate Salvina Tikashekia, who is supported by the White House, is now wanted in Belarus for attempting to organize a coup. Moreover, the National Endowment for Democracy has dozens of active programs in Belarus, as investigative journalist Alan McLeod reported. And this is from McLeod's article. Although not a single individual organization is named, it is clear from the scant public information it reveals that Washington is focusing on 3 areas: training activists and civil society organizations in nonviolent regime change tactics, funding anti-government media, and bankrolling election monitoring groups. Founded by the Ronald Reagan administration, founded during the Ronald Reagan administration, the National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, is a U.S. taxpayer-funded nonprofit which meddles in other countries' elections and politics seeking regime change. In 1991, co-founder Alan Weinstein explained that the Washington Post, a lot of what the NED does today was done covertly by the CIA 25 years ago. According to the Wall Street Journal, OFAC placed additional sanctions on the investigation arm of the country's Department of Financial Monitoring for its role in suppressing independent media and civil liberties in the country. The Belarusian flagship airline has already been sanctioned by the U.S. and European Union. In May of 2021, the Belarusian government forced down a flight from Greece to Lithuania to detain opposition figure Roman Prostovich, and he is a neo-Nazi blogger who has worked with Ukrainian forces. And so that's where a lot of the tensions between Minsk and the U.S. really escalated, but they seem to be undergoing another pretty significant round of escalation at this point. All right, let's move on to some news dealing with China. The first here is U.S. eyes Australia as a missile testing ground. The U.S. is considering using Australia as a missile testing ground as a part of the AUKUS military pact. AUKUS is a 3-way deal between the U.S., Britain, and Australia, primarily focused on technology sharing, with the goal of Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. The 3 nations have also announced their intention to jointly develop hypersonic missiles. U.S. Army Secretary Christine Wormuth said Australia's contributions to AUKUS don't have to be in dollars, and pointed to the vast uninhabited land as a testing ground for hypersonic and other types of long-range precision missiles. A challenge for us in the United States when it comes to hypersonics, or even some of our other things we'd like, the precision missile strike, which is not a hypersonic weapon but has a very long range in some of its increments, for us to find open spaces in the United States where we can actually test these weapons. It's a challenge, she said. Australia obviously has tremendous amount of territory where that testing is a little bit more doable. So I think it's a unique thing, as an example, that Australia brings to the table. So they, just want to fire their missiles all over Australia. Don't worry about the Australian environment or whatever, goes out in those what they say are uninhabited areas, and probably cause some major impacts on the Australian environment, just using the country as a testing range for our new weapons. All right, now this is Biden's new move against China. President Biden on Wednesday signed an executive order banning American investment in certain technologies in China, marking a significant escalation in the economic war against Beijing. The order prohibits American venture capitalists and private equity firms from investing in three technology sectors in China: semiconductors, quantum information technologies, and certain artificial intelligence systems. The order restricting investment in China has been years in the making, as the Biden administration officials have been at odds with how far the executive action should go. A Biden administration official said the order creates an outbound screening mechanism. The restrictions are being put in place under the guise of national security, and U.S. officials insist they are not trying to hurt economically, only prevent China's military from gaining access to U.S. technology. But, we do know the U.S. has this massive economic war going on against China, and so I'm sure that this is also seen as being part of that. All right, now some Middle East news. Israeli foreign minister calls for U.S. to give Saudi Arabia a defense commitment. The Israeli foreign minister, Eli Cohen, has called for the U.S. to provide Saudi Arabia with a defense commitment as Israel is vying for a normalization deal with Riyadh. While an Israeli-Saudi Arabia normalization deal is expected to be a long way off, Saudi Arabia has been looking to get security guarantees out of the U.S. if such an agreement ever happens. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, Cohen said the U.S. should base the security guarantees on what it provides South Korea. My recent trip to South Korea and the demilitarized zone was revealing. South Korea, despite living under the shadow of a nuclear-armed neighbor and having the means to develop its own nuclear weapon, has abstained from nuclear weapons development, Cohen said. A comparable American defense pledge could reassure Middle Eastern nations, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. So it's kind of interesting that one of the things that Israel seems concerned about here is Saudi Arabia getting nuclear weapons, and one of the reasons they want the U.S. to make these commitments to Saudi Arabia is so Saudi Arabia doesn't develop a nuclear program. Now, I'm very interested in these negotiations because there was some going on during the Trump administration, and it seemed that the Trump administration was unwilling to pursue it further with Saudi Arabia, in part because of what Saudi Arabia was demanding in the nuclear energy sharing agreement with the U.S. The U.S. During the Trump administration, and this, I believe this is the case, it's not exactly clear, but they were really pushing Saudi Arabia to agree to accept a 1-2-3 agreement, is what they call it, with their nuclear technology sharing. And I believe the UAE has received something like this. And I'm not sure of all the details in the nuclear process and everything like that, but essentially what the 1-2-3 agreement did was the UAE doesn't enrich its own nuclear fuel and things like that, or and create nuclear rods. They rely on the U.S. for that. So they had the reactors. I guess they could buy the uranium or plutonium or whatever they use to run the reactors, but rather than refining that, which you could refine into fuel, or I guess you could also refine into nuclear rods, or again, I guess use that as to make a nuclear weapon. The way the U.S. has this set up, it would be impossible under the agreement to take your nuclear waste and make a nuclear weapon with it, your nuclear fuel, and make a nuclear weapon with it. And so Saudi Arabia distinctly doesn't want to be trapped in that kind of agreement, and they want to do their own enrichment. And my assumption would be is because they want to have the ability either to develop a latent nuclear deterrent or to develop a full-on nuclear system. All right, so maybe an even worse decision going on here in the Middle East is that the U.S. military may put armed troops on commercial ships in the Strait of Hormuz. And this came out last week. The Associated Press reported this, and the idea is to protect commercial vessels from being seized by Iran but it could result in direct clashes between the U.S. and Iranian military. The U.S. has been steadily increasing its military presence in the Persian Gulf since Iran seized 2 tankers earlier this year, which was provoked by the U.S. seizing a tanker carrying Iranian oil. And so there's really 2 ways the U.S. could address the shipping situation with Iran. The first is that the U.S. could agree not to seize any more Iranian tankers and probably put this all behind us and, just show in the future that we're willing to stick with that commitment. The other is we could try repeated rounds of military escalation in the region, deploying more and more assets, more and more troops, and putting them in more forward positions and potential confrontation with the Iranian forces in order to try to defend these ships. One seems like a much better option to me. All right, let's move on, talk about the coup in Niger here. So this article from DataCampAntiwar.com, Niger Junta accuses France of violating airspace, freeing terrorists. Niger's ruling junta on Wednesday accused France of violating Niger's airspace and freeing what they dub as terrorists as tensions continue to rise in West Africa after the ousting of the former Niger president. The coup leader shut down Niger's airspace on Sunday to prepare for a potential military intervention as the Economic Community of West African States, this is ECOWAS, has threatened to use force to reinstate the former president, and that's Mohamed Bazoum. The junta, which is calling itself the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, said the French aircraft entered Niger's airspace from Chad on Wednesday morning, despite the ban on air traffic, and they say deliberately cut off all contact with air control. For their part, France, the former colonial ruler of Niger, denied the accusation and said the flight had been coordinated with Niger's military. So, it's possible that there's some miscommunication here. My guess is that the Niger government is probably quite a mess right now, and there may be some communication issues, and maybe some colonel or somebody did approve this. France said, oh, we're going to send in a military aircraft to pick up some of our troops. It didn't get communicated to somebody else, and then the government's warning are concerned that this is some kind of extreme military intervention. I guess my understanding is Niger doesn't have much, if at all, of an air force. They maybe have 2 fighter planes and a handful of helicopters. They don't really even have armored personnel vehicles, and so I don't think that we necessarily have to worry about Niger trying to shoot down any French planes or something like that. But this situation could get very hot very fast and could be a real issue. And I think the main way it could be bad would be the U.S. and Western led intervention. And one of the reasons I think that could happen is we have this here from Dave DeCamp Anti-War again here. Victoria Newland meets with Niger junta leaders. So this is the high priestess of death, Victoria Newland, traveled to Niger last week and earlier this week, she was there on Monday and held what she described as difficult talks with members of the junta. Newland wrote on Twitter, traveled to Niger to express grave concerns over the undemocratic attempts to seize power and to urge a return to constitutional order. Newland spoke with reporters on the phone after her talks and said the conversations were extremely frank and at times quite difficult, because, again, we are pushing for a negotiated solution. She said the coup leaders are quite firm in their views on how they want to proceed and does not comport with the Constitution of Niger. Newland says she met with one of the coup leaders who declared himself as Niger's defense chief and 3 other colonels. Journalist Nick Turris reported for The Intercept that one of the defense chief that Newland met with had previously received training from the U.S., something Newland mentioned on her calls with reporters. And so she said that we have relationships with all these people who took over Niger. And so I don't know. There's some very dark humor to that the U.S. trains all these soldiers and they end up carrying out coups that specifically go against the U.S. imperial ambitions in Africa. But this could also be a real problem, for Niger going forward if the West prompts the West African states to take action. So this is Nigeria Senate. So this is probably, well, it is one of the largest countries in Africa, I'm sure one of the more powerful countries in the region. Nigeria Senate has warned against military intervention in neighboring Niger after the Nigerian president requested backing for such an action against Niger's new military junta. Nigeria currently holds the rotating presidency of the ECOWAS, which was threatening to use military force if Niger's former president was not reinstated by Sunday. While the deadline has now passed, there is no sign of an imminent intervention in Niger. ECOWAS officials met Friday and said they have finalized intervention plans, but did not indicate when they plan on launching an attack. And so we see some dissent, and this could possibly push into a regional war, as Mali and some other countries have said that, look, if you guys go to war against Niger, we go to war on behalf of Niger. And so this is, I think, very complicated. And my guess is in some way it may play out in a Cold War kind of proxy war between Russia and the West, as there are a lot of countries in this region who have attempted to throw off the governments that were put in place following, the Western official colonialization. So, the West institutes these constitutions and they force these governments on these African countries, even after their, official, colonialization period of those countries end. And they still have a lot of control over what happens in those countries. And a few of these countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and a few others, have started to throw off those governments and say, look, this is a military dictatorship. Now, maybe they'll return to some other government one day, but they're basically ignoring the Western imposed constitutions. And some of those countries have turned to Moscow and particularly the Russian mercenary force, the Wagner group, to work with them and to train their soldiers and to provide them probably with some military equipment and even help them fight some of what, they deem the Islamists and jihadists in their territory. So this is, this could become a pretty big deal. At this point, it's not exactly clear how it's going to play out. Certainly hope it plays out in a way that's peaceful, and we will keep an eye on it on this show. All right, everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. I'll be back with more shows next week.